The world has come to a halt. Europe, a land once synonymous with power and civilization, now lies covered in the smoke of its own ruins. The banners of the Reich, which for years waved arrogantly over a subjugated continent, rot among the remnants of the cities their ambition destroyed. Berlin is a cemetery of stone and fire. Rubble has taken the place of avenues, and the echo of cannons blends into the murmuring of the defeated. In the basements of power, where orders to conquer the world were once issued, only silence remains, and fear. There, between bare walls and flickering lights, the men who dreamed of an eternal empire await their fate. Faces that once inspired terror are now reduced to shadows of the past. The architect of propaganda, the commander of extermination, the military strategist, the fanatic who believed himself a god, all gathered to face the inevitable. What did the Nazi leaders feel when confronted with the abyss of defeat? How did they react when the weight of their crimes, millions of stolen lives, devastated nations, shattered dreams, was thrown onto the table before them? Did they justify themselves, deny everything, cry? Was it justice or vengeance? The end of the war did not bring peace, but a new stage, an unprecedented trial. For the first time in modern history, the victors placed the architects of a global tragedy before an international tribunal. Thus was born the Nuremberg Tribunal, humanity's most ambitious attempt to give a name, a face, and a punishment to absolute evil. In those rooms, under the gaze of the victors and the scrutiny of the world, a process began that would forever change the meaning of the word guilt. The interrogations became a mirror of the human condition, where arrogance collapsed, where lies struggled to survive against truth, and where the men who ignited the greatest darkness of the 20th century were forced to answer for it. Here begins that story, the day the Third Reich fell, and its own architects faced the judgment of the world. It is 1945. Berlin has fallen. Hitler is dead. The Reich, which promised to last 1,000 years, has vanished into ashes in barely 12. The European landscape is no longer a moving battlefield. It is a scene of ruin where cities breathe smoke, infrastructures lie broken, and the traces of war mark every street. The grandiose claim of an empire collapsed with the same speed with which it was ignited. What remained was the heavy silence of empty squares and the murmur of the victors walking the avenues once inhabited by the powerful. The Allied powers, aware that victory could not be confined to mere military defeat, set to work with clinical urgency, gathering evidence that would give name and shape to the crimes committed. Documents, archives, testimonies, and objects seized from the offices of power were organized like pieces of a terrible mosaic. The task was titanic and methodical, cataloging the unspeakable so that the world could see, understand, and judge. In this way, they prepared the most important trial in history, not only as an exercise in retribution, but as a mechanism to establish a truth that would prevent denial. Everything collected, files, photographs, plans, orders, would become the framework of a process demanding answers and projecting a new way to measure collective and individual responsibility. Amid this work of collection and organization, the top Reich prisoners were moved from place to place, guarded by Allied soldiers advancing through ruins and walls. The journeys between prisons and detention rooms were short in distance, but long in psychological weight. Each step under watch was another part of the fall of a world built on absolute power. The environment around them was dense, echoes of boots closing doors, measuring glances. For some, the perception of what was happening was still clouded by the habit of command. For others, reality began to seep in as discomfort and alarm. Confusion, arrogance, and fear intertwined in the minds of these men. Some, accustomed to giving orders, could not quite believe they would now be subject to scrutiny. Their arrogance persisted as a reflex gesture, as if denying the fall could, for a moment, uphold the illusion of power. Others felt a deeper confusion. They did not fully understand the magnitude of the accusations being made against them, nor the new legal order being prepared to judge them. And fear, when it came, appeared in different forms. Fear of public exposure, fear of humiliation, fear of the inexorable justice ahead. That fear did not always have a face. Sometimes it manifested in silence, in trembling hands, in glances that no longer sought complicity, but a way out that did not exist. As Allied soldiers moved them between stone walls, some still believed they could justify the unjustifiable. This belief was part of the residual arrogance some maintained. The idea that rationalization, the tactic of shared blame, or the appeal to exceptional circumstances, would be enough to exonerate them. They clung to arguments intended to explain decisions and orders, as if war were a field of absolute necessity. But the goal of evidence collection was precisely to dismantle those alibis. In the hands of investigators were files that challenged these justifications. In the rooms where the trial would be organized, the pieces of the record spoke for themselves. The page that opened in 1945 was not only that of the end of a war, but also the initiation of a civilizing process that demanded naming what had occurred. The work of the Allied powers in gathering the evidence to sustain this prosecution was, in itself, a moral and political action, transforming horror into actionable knowledge so that justice could someday deliver its verdict. And in the transition between defeat and responsibility, the prisoners also experienced their intimate fall. From absolute command to interrogation, from certainty of impunity to the possibility of being called to answer before history. In a former officers' school converted into a prison, the interrogations begin. The hallways, which once echoed with orders and martial footsteps, now smell of dampness and stale coffee. The classrooms, transformed into cells and interrogation rooms, retain erased blackboards that hold the echo of forgotten lessons. Doors open and close with a metallic creak. Tall, narrow windows let in a sharp light that casts strips of brightness across worn wooden floors. There, in that place of learning turned site of surrender, the scene is prepared. Simple tables, hard chairs, and lamps hanging from the ceiling like relentless eyes. The rooms are cold. A low-hanging lamp casts harsh shadows on faces that once inspired terror. The shadows stretch across the walls like hands trying to capture words. The air is heavy. Each breath seems measured between silence and waiting. The interrogated enter escorted by guards, their steps slow, as if treading the end of something that is no longer theirs. They sit before a table, look at the lamp, and in its concentrated glow, see for the first time the possibility of being seen as never before, without glory, without uniform, without the network of excuses that once enveloped their actions. The main Allied interrogators present themselves not as immediate judges, but as craftsmen of truth. Their mission is clear and multifaceted: to obtain confessions, reconstruct the map of decisions, and expose the lies of the regime. They arrive with files, photographs and testimonies, with questions that act as probes, seeking to empty the alibis. They do not act out of easy rage. Their work is methodical, confronting facts with words, facts with documents, memory with evidence. Each interrogator is part of a larger machinery, whose goal is not only to punish, but to establish a public narrative leaving little room for ambiguity. The interrogations unfold like games of patience and pressure. Questions that seem innocuous gradually tighten the thread until the inner resistance of the interrogated yields or transforms. There are techniques of waiting and confrontation, planned silences, and replies that force the speaker to see their own argument from the outside. The interrogators know that true confessions often emerge from the clash between inner certainty and external evidence. They know the moment when justification ceases to hold. At that instant, the accused's words shrink, the phrases become brittle. "I was following orders," one repeats again and again. The phrase sounds like a worn refrain, a defense attempting to turn a moral problem into an administrative duty. It delivers a chain logic. Responsibility moves upward, as if the act itself ceases to exist outside the received order. The repetition seeks to anesthetize guilt. It attempts to transform choice into destiny. But the room is not a confessional. It is a space where every justification confronts the material traces of what occurred. The interrogator inserts the question that dismantles the excuse. And who gave the orders to kill millions? The phrase cuts through the air like a knife, leaving no room for evasion. It is not empty rhetoric. It is the question that forces responsibility to be located. By asking it, the interrogator demands not just a name, but the revelation of the chain that transformed decisions into extermination. The question pushes the alibi repeater to see the continuity between their action and the collective tragedy, to face the moral consistency of their "I followed orders." Every lie, every justification reveals something profound. Fear of losing one's own status, denial of one's agency, and resistance to admitting that a choice was made to act. The psychological analysis emerging in the room shows recurring patterns. Some deny with the same vehemence with which they once gave orders. Others look for technicalities, searching for terms that soften the brutality of the facts. A few fall into disbelief, unable to comprehend the scope of what their hands contributed to causing. Denial is not always intellectual. Often, it is an emotional refuge, protecting against unbearable guilt. Arrogance persists in some gestures, a hand that does not tremble, a mechanical phrase, a gaze attempting to impose another scenario. But confidence collapses before the files. Photos, lists, signed orders show the correspondence between the rhetoric of power and concrete facts. Where arrogance intended to erect walls, evidence opens cracks. Between the professionalism of the interrogators and the weight of proof, the scene becomes an operation of symbolic dismantling. Every assertion dismantled is one layer of impunity removed. Fear, when it appears, is not always expressed in words. It is drawn on the dry mouth, in eyes seeking a shortcut to escape, in the gaze trying to find an interlocutor to share the excuse. The interrogated who repeats, "I followed orders," may be stating a technical truth or asking through their speech for symbolic salvation, to be reduced to a cog, not an author. The interrogator, however, does not allow this migration of responsibility. The line between ordering and executing is clarified again and again. At the end of each session, The room remains with the echo of phrases and the trace of the question vibrating. And who gave the orders to kill millions? That question, not easily answered, embeds itself in the history of each detainee. The repetition of excuses and the systematic confrontation with evidence turn the prison school into a place of stripping. There, the rhetorical armor is removed, and one is forced to see the continuity between human will and its consequences. Within those walls, the operation of justice begins to write its most intimate part. Not only the collection of facts, but the revelation of the human condition when faced with its own network of excuses. And while the lamps continue to cast harsh shadows over faces that once inspired terror, each room becomes a theater where truth, slow and patient, undermines the perverse construction of impunity. Each one enters the room with a different face, that of wounded pride, the silent fanatic, the man who still believes he is right. The door closes behind them. The lamps cut the air into hard facets, and in this confined space not only bodies are exposed, but intimate architectures of pride, denial, and calculation. The chairs creak, papers pile up on the table, and the questions begin to touch the armor each one brings with them. They are no longer in the halls where they dictated destinies. They are in a room where their faces speak louder than their titles, and where the truth seeps through the cracks of pretense. Göring enters with a feint, the studious smile, the pose of the brilliant strategist who never loses his calm. He plays to dominate the scene, to turn every answer into theater, to seduce with the eloquence that remains. But behind that calculated smile hides something else, the desperation of someone who has lost control of his own destiny. The precision of his gestures is not enough to hide the unease rising up his neck when the questions force him to see the threads he once pulled. In his mind, there is a constant buzzing. How to articulate past greatness into present excuses. How to transform the fall into an anecdote. The strategic performance begins to crack under the cutting calm of those interrogating him. With each piece of evidence presented, the smile struggles to hold, and the strategic mask shows fissures. Höss appears with the countenance of a silent fanatic, eyes that initially do not betray the inner storm, a mouth that seems to measure words before releasing them. The calmness of his voice contrasts with the tension held in his fingers. Doctrines and certainties that until recently seemed to explain the world resonate in his mind. Now those certainties seek shelter in speeches that no longer find an echo. Silence becomes his tactic, not so much to negotiate as to conjure incomprehension. The faith that sustained him faces here the weight of relentless questions, and the rigidity of his thinking is both refuge and prison. Ribbentrop walks as one who still believes he is right. It is not an elegant conviction. It is the stubbornness of someone who has sewn his identity to a policy and cannot conceive another reading of the world. Sitting before the lamp, he seeks arguments to reorganize the truth in his favor, trying to translate the reason that was his banner into a legitimate defense. His thoughts are diplomatic calculations, trying to reconvert into moral justifications. It was necessity, it was the state, it was the logic of the era. But in the room, words confront evidence, and this conversion becomes increasingly forced. The sense of indisputable truth collapses into small contradictions that the interrogators patiently weave together. Keitel bears the face of wounded pride, the composure of one who executed orders, and now sees how the world questions the chain that sustained his actions. He believes in the discipline and structure that shaped him. This belief gives him refuge from accusations that turn him into the protagonist of decisions now appearing without redemption. In his mind pulses the idea that the war was the fulfillment of duty, that duty stands above personal judgment. But the room demands something different, not blind loyalty, but an explanation that allows obedience to be separated from disaster. That demand breaks the mechanism that previously allowed him to function without reflection. In all of them, the scene creates a mismatch between the external performance and the intimate truth. Public statements, memorable phrases, attempt to give the impression of coherence. Inner responses, however, move on a different frequency. Hidden regret, contained anger, the logic of moral survival. The interrogator pushes with precision, presenting documents, photos, names, returning each one to the continuity between their past words and present consequences. Faces that once inspired obedience now show human reactions. Sweat, hesitation, micro-gestures that betray the fracture. Göring, in particular, resorts to a theory attempting to rationalize the collective phenomenon. People do not want war, he would say, but you can always convince citizens to support it. You just have to tell them they are under attack. The phrase, spoken with the confidence of a manipulator, sounds in the room both as confession and explanation. In his mind, the mechanics of persuasion remain a valid strategy. Turning fear into mobilization, he transformed war into the product of a public construction. But hearing this phrase in the context of interrogation makes it testimonial. It is no longer an abstract theory, but a key to understanding how mass consent was manufactured and how those constructions were used to hollow out the lives of millions. As interrogators review documents and confront testimonies, that mixture of external performance and internal thought unfolds in all the interrogated. Some opt to minimize their agency, others to technicize it. A few, trapped by evidence, see their discourse disintegrate. The interrogations function as mirrors reflecting not only the concrete action, but the psychological configuration that sustained it. Arrogance, conviction, bureaucratic routine, the constant search for reasons to displace guilt. Confronted with this, the room forces an intimate inventory. What was choice and what was obedience? Where does politics end and crime begin? Each session leaves marks. A word that does not fit. A document's record, a heavier silence. Figures who entered with different faces leave with the consciousness that their rhetoric has been stripped away. Strategy and justification become insufficient under the weight of what is proven. The pretended greatness evaporates in the act of dismantling. Partial confessions, evasions, contradictions, all compose the account of the fall, not only political, but human. In this stripping away, minds that once planned and ordered confront, for the first time, the clear existence of consequences. There are no more panegyrics to protect, no walls to hide the relationship between will and devastation. Interrogators know that every word can decide a life, but they also know they are facing the architects of horror. This premise becomes flesh in every session. The room transforms into a crossroads of destinies, where the interrogator's voice can seal not only the fate of an individual, but the legitimacy of a new order. Across the table, the questions are not mere technical procedure. They are moral instruments that open the possibility of distinguishing between obedience and crime, between alibi and confession. The awareness of that power weighs on the shoulders of the one asking. Every yes or no reverberates beyond the room, reinforcing the need for justice and fueling the debate about what it means to redress a collective crime. Interrogators face daily a dilemma that offers no easy solutions. To what extent can the pursuit of truth become revenge? The line is fragile. On one hand is the urgency of not allowing executioners to hide behind technicalities and orders. On the other, the temptation to turn the procedure into a settling of scores that replicates the brutality it seeks to condemn. This contrast demands constant reflection. Justice requires method, evidence, and proportionality. Collective emotion demands punishment, exposure, and the feeling that inflicted pain does not go unpunished. Moving between both poles, interrogators act with the discipline of jurists, and the tension of those who know the world watches every gesture. In those rooms, not only men were judged, but ideas. Obedience, loyalty, guilt. Concepts that were once mere cogs in the political machine are now under scrutiny. Dismantling ideology involves showing how doctrines translated into orders and how orders became concrete acts. Interrogators seek to trace that causal line. It is not enough to state that someone followed orders. One must reconstruct the chain that turns rhetoric into extermination. Every answer that minimizes individual responsibility confronts the necessity to prove the direct relationship between intellectual decision and material action. Some interrogators recount, in a contained voice, the human burden of their work. Asking was carrying someone else's agony, they say. They recall how, after a session, unanswered questions kept resonating. Images that would not fade, names that could not remain unplaced in history. There are testimonies from guards and investigators who confess having felt for years the responsibility not to fail in reconstructing documentation. Every checked document, every witness heard, was a brick to build the possibility of just sanction. That sense of duty was their shield against the temptation of pure revenge. The tension also manifests in internal debates among the Allies themselves. What is justice in a crime of industrial scale? Maximum penalties, public trials, long processes seeking truth, or exemplary executions. The discussion is not only legal, but ethical. Interrogators debate the effectiveness of forcing the accused to face the evidence versus the immediate public demonstration that satisfies popular perception of retribution. Amid these exchanges, some remember that the ultimate goal is for society to recognize the truth and not forget. Thus, methodical, documented, reasoned procedure takes precedence over the remnants of collective anger. Emotion runs through every statement. When an interrogator hears "I followed orders," they not only seek to dismantle that phrase with evidence, they also try to read it as a symptom of a collapsed moral structure. Many investigators recount the difficulty of separating personal repulsion from cold analysis, how to maintain objectivity without numbing empathy for the victims. That tension turned the work into a kind of spiritual exercise, transforming indignation into rigor and rage into procedure. For them, justice is an art that demands precisely that balance. In practice, the room was filled with moments that seemed like small moral trials. A pause too long before an answer. A gesture of remorse that appears and disappears. Insistence on technicalities that attempts to turn crime into administrative procedure. Interrogators learn to read these signs as internal maps. Lies repeated too often reveal an attempt at self-deception. Evasion, when faced with specific names, reveals a chain of command someone wants to hide. Interpreting these signs was part of the craft. Each gesture was linked to a web of responsibilities that had to be unraveled. And yet, in this effort to apply the law, the most difficult question also emerged. Is it possible to repair the irreparable? Interrogators knew the law can punish, history can name, but it cannot return lost lives. This awareness, as harsh as it was necessary, fueled the decision that the process should not only seek punitive adjustments, but also establish memory and education to prevent repetition. For this reason, many sessions focused on meticulous detail: dates, orders, names, transports, codes. Everything had to be documented so that the truth would be unquestionable and justice anchored in verifiable facts, not in the momentary thirst for revenge. At the end of each cycle of interrogations, professionals recorded an ambivalent feeling: relief at having added pieces to the puzzle of truth, and sorrow at the certainty that no sentence would restore what was taken. We did what we could, some say, but we knew human justice has limits against the magnitude of horror. This confession summarizes the central moral clash: the obligation to judge in the face of the impossibility of restitution. In this clash, between the demand to punish and the humility to recognize limits, perhaps the most authentic form of response to evil was forged. Not revenge, but the will for history to name it and prevent it. Höss pretends not to remember. His mouth closes like a curtain that does not let the memory pass through. His eyes stare at a fixed point on the wall, as if an image too terrible could shatter if he looked at it directly. His hands fidget with a paper he never finishes reading. His voice, when attempting to speak a sentence, gets stuck at the edge of his throat and retreats. The performance of forgetfulness is meticulous. Calculated pauses, gestures that mark a distance between past and present. In his mind, there is a double movement, seeking shelter in confusion while simultaneously fleeing the abyss that memory offers. His simulation does not fool the room. It is a fragile defense aiming to turn responsibility into absence. Ribbentrop stammers. Words escape him in fragments, as if his internal language had shattered into pieces. He tries to reconstruct diplomatic arguments and terminologies that once served him to weave agreements. Now those same words betray him and become incomplete sounds. The stammer reveals the fissure between the logic that sustained his career and the evidence that shatters it. Every attempt at explanation disperses among documents that contradict him. In his mind, there is a sum of reasons that once seemed coherent and that, under the light of interrogations, unravel into contradictions. The confusion is not only of memory, it is the acknowledgement that the theory he defended cannot withstand the weight of facts. Göring laughs. His laughter at first sounds like a gesture of superiority, a theatrical form of resistance, trying to keep the scene in his favor. He plays with tone, theatricality, and distracting words. But the laughter is not always mockery. At times, it turns into a nervous tic, a sign of despair attempting to camouflage under the shine of a pose. Behind the mask of irony, the perception of the end emerges, the feeling that he no longer controls either the narrative or his own fate. The laughter becomes a noise that belies his confidence. It is the last gesture of someone still trying to direct the play, when no stage remains to support it. Everyone knows the Reich no longer exists. It is a silent certainty that fills the room. The architecture of power that once seemed eternal has become a skeleton. On the faces there are shadows of acceptance and denial. In gestures, the evidence of moral decay becoming physical. There is no need to proclaim defeat with grandiose phrases. Defeat is read in the way men walk, in the clumsiness with which they seek an alibi, in how their hands avoid each other. The intimate understanding of the fall is a weight that accompanies them, and even if some deny it, acknowledgement seeps into every contained breath. In every confession, there is an echo of horror. The words admitted leave behind invisible scenes, departing trains, names written on lists, doors that closed forever. Each sentence carries a resonance that is not only semantic, it is the reverberation of what occurred, the way the human voice can conjure, by error or truth, images that explain the crime. The interrogators know this and listen. In the echo of a confession, a map of suffering opens that forces naming, specifying, and linking each act to its consequence. In every silence, a mountain of invisible corpses. When denial prevails and words do not emerge, the room fills with a mute weight that language cannot reduce. That silence is not emptiness, it is presence, the accumulation of lives that can no longer speak, the density of absences that suffocates more than any scream. The interrogated who cling to their lie seek, through that silence, to protect themselves from confronting the truth. But the void they try to create becomes an unbearable witness, evidence that needs no voice to exist. "I was just following orders," one repeats. The phrase is a refrain that returns as defense and prayer. He wants to turn his action into function, his crime into administrative routine. He desires responsibility to dissolve into the chain. But the interrogator's reply cuts that rope. "And millions died following yours." The response does not aim to humiliate for humiliation's sake. It seeks to situate the individual act within the network of consequences. It is the question that forces one to see the moral continuity between command and death. The oral statement of the interrogator restores to the room the true measure. It is not a technical excuse, but the acknowledgement of the human dimension of the harm. Some break down. Words that once had composure collapse into sobs. The body loses composure, and unplanned truth emerges. The rupture does not always arrive with grandiosity. Often it is a fine thread that, when strained, snaps with a whimper. A confession peeks through sobs, a mention of a name that can no longer be hidden. These moments are explosions of humanity, showing the fragile boundary between the will to deny and the inability to maintain the lie in the face of evidence. In them, the lamps cast not only harsh shadows, but also light that pierces the armor. Others cling to the lie with nails and teeth, repeating formulas, technicalities, legalisms, transforming moral decisions into administrative procedures, seeking protection in language to make action abstract. It is stubbornness, not to see an order, not to feel guilty. A cover-up exercise attempting to resist the pressure of records and testimony. That resistance, sometimes desperate, sometimes cold, also reveals the fear of total collapse. Admitting the crime would mean losing everything, even the identity forged by giving orders and measuring destinies. Thus, sessions unfold, between fractures and perseverance, between confessions that sound like truth and silences hiding mountains of corpses. In every gesture, in every word, the map of responsibility is drawn. There are no moral shortcuts, nor excuses that can erase the continuity between order and effect. The room records this clash between the will to be exonerated and the inexorable force of evidence. And in this record, an essential part of collective memory about what happened is written. The interrogation rooms are empty. Documents, photographic archives, lists of names, and meticulously compiled files are stacked in boxes that will soon travel to the courts. Prisoners who once walked with the arrogance of those who believed power was on their side now walk with steps that seem to measure the distance to an inevitable fate. Every gesture, every glance, is filled with contained tension. The air that was once heavy with justifications and excuses is now filled with anticipation, with expectant silence. Soon, those same voices that repeated phrases like, "I was just following orders," or "I only obeyed," will be heard before the entire world, exposed not only to judges, but to the eyes of humanity, which for years awaited answers and justice. The change in the prisoners is palpable. The pride that once shaped every phrase, every gesture, turns into fear. A fear that seeps through hunched shoulders, through eyes that no longer seek to avert their gaze but fix on points, trying to find a lifeline that does not exist. Each step toward the courtroom is a step that confirms reality. There are no alibis left, no gestures that can reconstruct the illusion of power. Fear slowly transforms into despair, and in that despair emerge glimpses of humanity previously hidden behind the mask of authority. Doubts, regrets, gestures that reveal an intimate understanding of the magnitude of their acts. The fall of the Reich is reflected in every face. The certainty that nothing can erase what has been done weighs on them like an inevitable black horizon. The whole world waits. For years, the war had left Europe in shadows, with millions of victims crying out in the silence of history. Now, humanity focuses its gaze on a single point: the courtroom preparing to hear those who brought the continent to the brink of catastrophe. The questions the interrogators asked in private will now be heard publicly. Every word will be analyzed, every silence interpreted, every lie confronted with irrefutable evidence. Global anticipation is not merely curiosity, but a moral necessity to understand, to judge, and to establish the truth after years of oppression and violence. The patience and rigor of the interrogations are transferred to the broader stage, where justice will be not only legal, but also symbolic, a beacon pointing toward accountability before history. While the prisoners wait their turn, the days feel like months. The internal transformation is constant. Those who arrived confident in their immunity now feel that every decision, every order, every act they justified becomes evidence of guilt. Despair and fear intertwine with memories of victims, with images of trains, camps, and destroyed cities. Names that once meant nothing individually now unfold as figures with faces and context. The abstraction of obedience becomes the concretion of crime. And in that recognition, the minds of the accused oscillate between denial and acceptance, between cold defense and inevitable human trembling. The connection between the interrogations and the final trial is inseparable. Every word spoken under the pressure of the interrogators, every lie confronted, every partial confession will now serve to underpin the process that will begin before the world. Documents, testimonies, and accumulated evidence build a bridge from the shadows of prison to the public clarity of justice. There, history becomes witness, and the accused become protagonists of a narrative that, though incomplete in words, cannot hide the facts or responsibility. The Nuremberg trial, then, is not merely a legal procedure. It is the materialization of years of meticulous work, investigation, and moral confrontation. where every detail of the interrogations will echo in the courtroom and in humanity's memory. At every moment before the trial, tension rises. The prisoners can no longer hide their vulnerability. Every gesture reveals the mix of fear, broken pride, and despair that now dominates their interior. Hours become heavy, steps slower, and the wait prolongs the perception of inevitable fall. The world that for years witnessed their orders will now witness their explanations, their inability to sustain lies in the face of evidence, and the total exposure of their responsibility. The echo of justice, once seemingly distant, becomes tangible. And in that space, history prepares to listen to those who for more than a decade believed they could sustain terror with words, and who now must confront them before all. The Nuremberg interrogations were not merely a search for the guilty. They were a monumental effort by humanity to look at itself, to unravel the threads of a horror that seemed endless, and to confront the destructive capacity that men had deployed with order and meticulousness. Each session, each question, each pause carried the weight of millions of destroyed lives, and the interrogators, judges, and witnesses felt it in every gesture, in every word that emerged from the lips of the accused. It was an exercise that combined legal precision with moral introspection, an attempt to name the unnameable and to understand the machinery that transformed ideas into extermination. Humanity not only demanded accountability, but also sought to understand how obedience and ideology had become instruments of mass death. In those rooms, every silence resonated louder than any scream. The words of the accused, sometimes empty, sometimes precise, were pierced by the echo of millions of victims. Phrases like, "I was just following orders," clashed with the inescapable reply, "and millions died following theirs." That confrontation was not only of legal value, it was a way to show how individual morality had been subordinated to a system of systematic violence. The prisoners' faces showed fear, broken pride, restrained despair, and every gesture revealed the internal struggle between denial of responsibility and tacit acknowledgement of the disaster they had helped perpetrate. There, the trial measured not only crimes, but also the human capacity to assume guilt, to face the truth without shields. The interrogators and judges became witnesses to a living history unfolding before them. Feeling the tension of those who had issued death orders, observing how some broke down while others held fast to their lies, required constant vigilance of mind and heart. Every pause, every hesitation, every nervous gesture revealed as much as any document or physical evidence. Interpreters, witnesses, and legal experts participated in this framework, aware that what occurred in those rooms was not merely a bureaucratic procedure, but the construction of a memory that had to withstand the passage of time. Every detail was documented, every partial confession analyzed, and every resistance to truth recorded with the intention that the historical account remain complete, relentless, and human at once. At the heart of the interrogations also arose reflection on the limits of justice and compassion. It was understood that no sentence could repair the damage inflicted, that no verdict could restore stolen lives, but that the act of confronting the responsible with evidence, of forcing them to look into the eyes of history, constituted a fundamental principle, that humanity could and should set limits on barbarity. The combination of legal rigor and moral empathy turned each session into a solemn act, a space where truth and ethics converged to create something greater than mere condemnation. A historical record that would serve to educate, prevent, and reflect on the depths to which blind obedience and unrestrained ideology could lead. In those rooms, not only confessions were written, the principle of modern justice was written, the foundation on which international tribunals would be established, norms for war crimes set, and precedents laid that still resonate in the contemporary world. Every document, every testimony, every answer compelled by evidence became a brick in that monumental construction of memory and responsibility. History was placed before the mirror of morality, and men who once seemed untouchable found themselves exposed to the evidence of their acts, forced to confront not only their destiny, but also the gaze of the entire world. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment if you enjoyed the video. Your support helps us continue sharing more stories that deserve to be remembered. In every click, every comment, every interaction, the importance of memory, of learning from history, and of recognizing that even in the deepest shadows of humanity, the light of truth and justice can open paths that collective memory will never allow to be forgotten, is reaffirmed. The lessons of Nuremberg do not end in the courts. They live in every reflection, in every discussion, and in every decision not to repeat the mistakes of the past, building a legacy of responsibility and awareness that spans generations.